All right. Um, I don't remember exactly where I left off with chapter 11, but I want to start with chapter 11 anyway. Women began to gain in a few positions, particularly they became teachers and actresses. Now, believe it or not, when Shakespeare put on his plays, the idea of women getting on the stage and acting was frowned upon by all of Christianity. So even in the case of Romeo and Juliet, Juliet was always played by a young boy. Then, as time went on, they started making allowing women to come on stage as actresses, and it's difficult to tell whether it was good or bad or not. Folk, I think all of you know the personal lives of many, many actors and actresses leave a whole lot to be desired. And if you don't want to live very long, maybe go into the acting bit. All right, I'll be quiet. But I mean, folk, if I'm wrong, you can tell me. Nobody's disagreeing with me. All right. There are some. I mean, here. Now, the first college to admit women was Oberlin College. Now, I must also say that Oberlin College admitted black men, but it did not admit black women. So there was still some discrimination and segregation going on. But women, it was found out that women made better teachers, particularly teachers of young students. These women would, like the factory working women, they were often unmarried women, and they were willing to work for very low pay. Oftentimes, women teachers at this time were women in their late teens, 17, 18, and 19 years old, and the same thing with the factory workers. There was no limit. 17, 18, and 19-year-old young women who were unmarried, and they would work until they got married, at which time they would leave. And the same thing with the teachers. The teachers would work until they got married, and then they would leave and tend to their home. Now, you often had some of your women who never married, and sometimes they would be permanently fixed in the factories or permanently fixed as school teachers, or the old maid school teacher of the bygone days, and maybe of modern times also. The Waltham system, again, that was a system of using young women as laborers. The problem was in England. They would hire these women and keep them on even after they were married, but a woman working in a factory was permanently poor, had no chance to better herself. She usually could not find another job, and she got just very, very low minimum wage payments for her wage. And she'd work sometimes in England, in Europe, for all of her life. Well, we did not want that here, so we told the women, as soon as you get married, you must leave. And when they married, they left, and they would help their husband with housework and whatever else their duties would require them to do. The theater blossomed at this time. Again, this was before the invention of movies. And even though theatrics and acting had been frowned upon by Christianity for the longest of time, but nevertheless, a lot of those taboos went out the window, and theatrics became popular. And a lot of the acting, the theatrics had to do with freeing of slaves. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book that was written a little bit later than the time we're talking about, but it was a book against slavery, and it was made into a play and put on as a play in various stages around the country. Oratory became a really, really big thing. Preachers and teachers would appeal not to a person's intellect, but to a person's emotions. The most famous orator of the time was a politician named Daniel Webster, who was a New England politician, New Hampshire, I believe, but somewhere in New England. And his job, which he tried to hold the Union together, but he spoke out hard against splitting up the Union. Ran for president at least once, did not make it, but he was prominent at this time. And preachers at this time would appeal to the emotion to try to hold crowds spellbound. a religious revival occurred called the Second Great Awakening. Now, these revivals sometimes featured excess. I mean, people would get around with whips and use the whips to beat trees, trying to beat the devil out of the trees, and sometimes would whip themselves, trying to punish themselves for their sin, their own sins. But they would meet in camp meetings. Now, the camp meeting still goes on in some circles, but these camp meetings where they'd get together, get up early in the morning, eat breakfast, then go to a sermon, to listen to a sermon. Break for lunch, eat lunch, then go back to the afternoon, listen to an afternoon sermon by a different preacher. Then break, have an evening meal, then go back and listen to an evening sermon by still a different preacher. These preachers, again, appealed to the emotion. They were fiery preachers. The evangelicals were the most to have the revivals, the camp meetings. So the revival and camp meeting, a lot of times the two terms overlap. Even though revival usually connotes a local church, a camp meeting is area-wide. But they would camp out sometimes in tents, sometimes they'd sleep in their wagons, and sometimes they'd just simply sleep on the hard ground with not much over them to protect them. They'd go do this for weeks. The two groups that had the most converts during this time were the Baptist and Methodist. This was to remain true in the South for many, many years. The Baptists and Methodists, because they appealed to the more common people, and they appealed to the emotion, and the Baptist preachers go around dressed like farm workers, and not dressed in nice suits and ties, and the Methodists would do similar. Again, appeal to emotion. Now, one thing that has changed in modern times, the two biggest movements in the South are now Baptist and Pentecostal. The Methodists have declined somewhat, and again, for reasons I won't get into. Now, a lot of times, during these times of revival, people get an emotional high, and then when the revival's over, they go back to living the same old way they had before. But it's believed that there were some permanent changes made as a result of the revival. Number one, the idea of predestination was greatly weakened. Predestination taught that you were helpless, you could not do anything of yourself, your whole destiny for all of eternity was foreordained. You couldn't be saved unless you were chosen among the elect. The revivals taught that you could choose to be saved or choose not to. The revivals also taught that we could better society. So the people began to think of ways to improve society, and one of the first ones was they felt like they needed to end slavery and control drinking. That's what the word temperance means. Actually, not just control drinking, but to completely stop drinking. Now, I want to elaborate on the drinking a little bit. In Europe, because the water was so bad, nearly every European had to drink because it was difficult to drink the water. And most of the time they could control it. But occasionally it got out of hand. However, the drinking would cause many accidents, and this was in the days before automobiles, because a drunk person would take risks and make bad judgments that he would not make when he is sober. Well, your factories came along, and the word factory connotes machinery. Then the factory owners realized they needed to have people operating their machines who were sober. Now, I worked at a factory 27 years, and sometimes my factory wouldn't fire them, it would send a person home who they felt like it had too much. They got close to me, well, hey, you've had too much, take a taxi, go home, don't drive. But this actually happened when I was at Lockheed. And every factory had their limits, but they just felt like they could not allow a person to operate factory machinery. He was under influence. Well, the factory owners began to get with the preacher and say, can you please preach temperance? Please get your people to not drink. Tell them how wrong it is and how, quote a few scripture here and there, to not drink at all. And it worked. The drinking was curbed, not completely stopped. Now, where this was to lead eventually, it was to lead to a constitutional amendment, Amendment number 18, that forbade any drinking and the sale of alcoholic beverages. This amendment stayed on the books for several years and eventually was partially repealed. But the 21st Amendment did not say it was legal to drink, just simply turned it back over to the states. And each state decide. And some counties in the South are still what you call dry counties. That goes back to that time period. Now, I do want to say this about drinking, folk. This might be hard to understand at first. Personally, I don't touch the stuff. But I would never campaign for it to be made a law, because the countries that have outlawed drinking, and there are a lot of them, are countries that do not make any kind of scientific or technological progress. And what's the connection between drinking and scientific progress? Simply this: the nations that forbid drinking forbid other forms of free expression also. The free expression is necessary in order to invent. Most of your inventions were made by people who heard it can't be done, and they said we can. But what if the law had outlawed Robert Fulton's steamship? What if the law had outlawed the Wright brothers' airplane? If the Wright brothers had lived in Morocco, they would never have invented anything. And for those of you from Morocco, I'm not going to apologize, because that's what I think. But anyway, if the Wright brothers had lived practically anywhere in North Africa, they would not have invented anything. If Thomas Edison had lived in any of those countries, he would not have invented anything. Those countries have not invented anything in more than 1,000 years. And again, you prohibit something that should be prohibited, and then you wind up prohibiting something that you shouldn't prohibit. I see at least one ahead. It doesn't seem like you understand, but yes?
When you said end slavery and control drinking, who are you talking about, the Baptists or the Methodists?
The whole country at one time passed a law, the 18th Amendment, that outlawed all drinking. And the temperance people, the Women's Christian Temperance Union still exists, and it tries to convince people to not drink at all, completely abstain. But they don't have law. In other words, they're no longer trying to get Congress to pass a law, because right now that's impossible. But
you said that there was an 18th Amendment as well?
yeah, WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU, it still exists, but it doesn't have the following it once had. But these women went around. For one thing, Bobby Cox could tell you something about this. Drunken men are more likely to beat their wives or slap their wives than men who are sober. What drink does for you, and a lot of you, you want to argue this, go ahead and drink low. Everybody will feel like something like once in a while, like socking something. But if you're sober, whoops, your better judgment steps in, you don't do it. If you're drunk, you go ahead and do it, and then have to face the consequences for it. And one man, he came home drunk, his wife scolded him, and he slapped her. She called the police, and the police photographed it, and the next day had to face all of his fellow co-workers, and because it got out in the newspapers. It was terribly embarrassing to him. It was terribly. But he and his wife quickly made up, and it's blown up. See, this is smart that the law takes over now, because a woman who's abused will oftentimes, it's blown out of proportion. We really are getting along. No, we're not. Anyway. All right, so much for that. Now, a man named William, I must mention, Charles Grandison Finney was the #1 preacher of the Second Great Awakening. And again, he was a very highly emotionally charged preacher. And he would move crowds to tears. And he would preach, you need to get saved right now. Don't put it off. Make your decisions right now. Politicians started following the same thing to get their point across. Charles Finney believed that it was possible to lead a completely sinless life here in this life. And that's theology, and I don't want to discuss that really. But each of you can make up your own minds for yourself what you believe. But he believed it was possible. Now, on a bad note too, Charles Finney went to England one time and started preaching to England that everybody is the same, everybody is equal in the sight of God. Some high-born women in England, members of the nobility, landed gentry, said, I'm better than those low-down poor people. And Charles Finney actually had to adjust his sermons to keep from offending the higher-ups. Again, I know what most of you would probably think of that, but this was a different time period, folk. And you have to judge these people based on the time that they lived. and not judge them by 2019 standards. Today, hardly any preacher, in any denominational preacher, you can lead a sinless, completely sinless life here in this life. Even though a few do, still. All right. Oh yeah, the Female Moral Reform Society taught to curb every form of sexual impurity, including brothels, houses of prostitution, and all adultery and fornication. Each person ultimately has to decide about this issue for himself or herself also. You cannot make laws against this kind of thing, folk. Now, you can outlaw it in your personal life, and which is where these issues should be decided by every one of us in our personal lives. But to try to outlaw it, to get the law on the books. I've said this to one class many years ago. I don't say it often, but Jesus and the disciples never went to a government official asking that government official to pass laws that favored their morality. I mean, I believe all these men were highly moral folk, but they did not try to get their morals across by legislation. It's got to be done by persuasion and not by coercion. The nations that try to do it by coercion are not creative, are not inventive. There was a move against slavery at this time, particularly in the North. And a lot of persons wanted to send freed slaves out. So some slaves were purchased by these people. I mean, they'd get together and pool their money. And they would send them to a country called Liberia. Oops. Liberia is still there on the map. It's in the coast of West Africa. Problem was, the Liberians, once they got to Africa, they began to live the only life they knew. The stronger of them built large plantation houses, built a plantation system, and they began to buy and sell the weaker ones into slavery. They sold each other into slavery. Black selling black. So again, this was all the life they knew, and they simply copied the life that they'd come from here in the southern United States. The nation was divided over the issue of abolition more than any other issue had. Now, abolition, the people who fought were called abolitionists. That means abolish slavery, and they wanted to do it right now. The most famous abolitionist was William Lord Garrison, who published a newspaper called The Liberator. Garrison preached, free the slaves now by any means that whatever, just do it. And the southern people have, well, where do the slaves go and what do they do, and how are they fed, how are they clothed, how are they housed, what kind of jobs they get? Come on to answer some questions. Garrison didn't care about the questions, just free them, and free them now. So again, he became friends with another black man named Frederick Douglass. Douglass was a slave who had gotten loose and went around the North teaching that slaves should be freed. Now, there were 3 women, black women, involved in this, and they all were a lot alike in one way. They were Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and Grandma Moses. They were all slaves themselves to start, and they all ran away and escaped slavery. Then they dared do the unthinkable. They came back to the South and helped slaves get freed through the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad is not in this chapter, but it is in a later chapter. It was neither underground nor was a railroad. The Underground Railroad was where that certain white man would keep the slaves hidden in the daytime, often in their basements or in their barns. Then at night they'd put these slaves under a haystack and move the haystack to the next, what they called station. And then before dawn they'd drop these slaves off to the next station. And then the slaves would hide out during the day, and then at night go to the next station. This was Underground Railroad, and of course the destination was always to the north, and it'd go, most of the time they went to Canada. And a lot of you black Canadians to this day are former slaves who have been freed. Sometimes they went to New York or Pennsylvania. If they went to Canada, they could be guaranteed freedom because the United States was not allowed to go into Canada and collect its lost slaves. But eventually a law was passed saying that slave owners could go to any northern state, find their slaves, and bring them home. So they were not really free unless they went to Canada. This was the Underground Railroad. Now, a case of, I know Grandma Moses. She knew that the slaves would assemble, meet around campfires at night, and start telling each other stories and telling each other what had happened to them during the day. Well, she'd all of a sudden appear, and every black knew that when she appeared, you went, whether you wanted to or not. Well, if any black man doesn't want to go, she'd pull out a revolver. Say, you're going. Because she knew that anyone who didn't go would quickly tell on her, and she would not be able to get away. So all the blacks had to flee, they had to go with her, whether they wanted to or not. And most of the people, well, actually all the people that she tried to free, got freed. Some of them were returned to their masters. All of them got freed. Again, blacks helping other blacks escape slavery. All right. Someone pointed out that I did not mention about women's rights. Believe me, I'm going to have a lot to say about that later, but I kind of skipped it in the last chapter. But women's rights is something we're going to see appear in every chapter, I believe every chapter, except for maybe one or two from here on out up until modern times. Now, Andrew Jackson defined the Democratic Party, and the party he started has lasted a lot to this day. The Democratic Party has generally stood for the party of the poor person, the common person, the downtrodden, and it's the party that's promised to help the downtrodden the most. Now, don't get me wrong, folks. I do not in any way intend to push for the Democratic Party, but nevertheless, just simply stating historical fact. The Republican Party was looked on as being the party of the rich. And I think I told this class last Saturday, Robin Hood would have been better off, and so as if he'd have robbed the poor and given that money to the rich. You might say, why? Because the rich know how to handle it better. And if we had done that, perhaps we'd now have colonies on the moon and men walking around on Mars. But instead, he robbed the rich to give to the poor, and the result was, I mean, if he existed at all, but a lot of people, a lot of outlaws have done that. Have justified their thievery by saying, oh, we only steal from the rich and we help the poor. The poor need to help themselves. And I say this having grown up in poverty myself and having found myself more than once in my lifetime with obligations here and an income here, folks. It's no fun. And it's probably going to happen to every one of you at some point. Hey, it happened to Donald Trump more than once. 30 years ago, we learned that Donald Trump's net worth was zero. That means he owed as much as he had. But he got out of it. All right. What about the Indians? Well, a lot of presidents have tried to civilize the Indians. A big problem with civilizing the Indians, folk, was, hold on to your seat, was their women. The American Indian women were largely in charge. And they had knew that the white man's Bible said that women would be under subjection. They felt like, hey, we'll be lower as a Christian than we were as an Indian spirit worshiper. We'll be higher because Christianity requires that we subject ourselves to the men. So Christianizing the Indians proved to be very, very difficult. And Andrew Jackson came along and he said it's impossible. So he's got Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act that told the Indians you must move to Oklahoma. And here's what he told them. He said, once you go to Oklahoma, folk, now he meant well. The white man will never get that far west, and you will be free from us, and you can live your own life out there the way you want to, and we promise we'll never bother you again because we'll never get that far out. All of you hopefully know better. But Jackson actually believed that the Indian would be safe from the whites in Oklahoma. When the Indians wouldn't leave, the Indians took the case to the Supreme Court. Now, right here nearby was the capital of Cherokee Nation. The capital was in Calhoun, Georgia. And the little towns of Calhoun and Fairmount and Spring Place and even Dalton. And you know anything about those towns? A few of you, yeah. Those are the Cherokee Nation was a nation within a nation. An Indian chieftain named Sequoyah had built an alphabet, and he lived in a mansion and was fairly rich. The town of Dahlonega also, where there was gold, was also part of it. The people of Georgia wanted to get the town of Dahlonega. Also, a lot of Georgians wanted to move into Indian territory. Well, the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in the Indians' favor. Jackson wouldn't take that. He said, Mr. Marshall, that's the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. I, the president, have the army. I, the president, am in charge of the militia, and I'm in charge of the Navy, and he isn't. So Jackson went in and forced the Indians out. They went along the Trail of Tears. Now, if you look on a map, the Trail of Tears was an illogical way to get from North Georgia and southern Tennessee. It was an illogical way to get to Oklahoma, because it went up through, of all places, up through Illinois and then down. And why didn't it go directly across Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas? I don't know, but it was a long route. And 1/4 of the Indians died along the way. But the Indians, now some Indians hid in the Appalachian Mountains. Their descendants are still there to this day. And then your Seminole Indians, who bragged that they never surrendered. They lived in the Everglades, where the rattlesnakes got to be 8 foot long, and where that alligators could get very, very large. And there are also all kinds of other wild beasts like bobcats and scorpion and whatever that the white man did not like to deal with, but the Indians could handle. Those Indians in the Everglades, the Seminole, never did surrender. A lot of them were not removed. But the South removed almost all of its Indians. And to this day, there are not that many Indians that live in the South, though there are a few. The Cherokee tribe almost had assimilated. And really, the standard view today is that if only they had been left alone, they might have become part of us. And you have to judge Jackson that he was wrong. I mean, even though if he hadn't done it, sooner or later a president would have come along who would have. All right, moving on, Tariff of Abominations. The Tariff of Abominations was passed. Now, all right, backing up a little bit. Andrew Jackson was a Tennessean. In other words, a Southerner. When he got in office, the Southerners rejoiced. They said, we now have our man in office, and he'll do our bidding, because he's one of us. However, Jackson got in to be president, and he realized, in order to build a strong army that I want, in order to build a strong navy, I need money. Now, folk, if you have a close buddy who one day gets in a position of executive leader, you might find that person undergoes a transformation in his thinking, a change. Executives do not see the world as the rest of us see it. Jackson became the nation's chief executive, and he saw that he needed money to build the army and navy he wanted, so he signed into law a tariff bill. The North thought, hey, this is great. He's on our side. The Southerners didn't like it. In the meantime, some personal issues came up. Andrew Jackson had as a Secretary of War a man named John O'Neill. John O'Neill married a woman named Peggy. The problem with this woman, Peggy, she was a dance girl. And the high society Washington women did not like her. They looked on her as being immoral, lewd, or whatever, and would not recognize her and would not invite her to their parties. Now, because Jackson's wife was deceased, Mrs. Calhoun, the vice president's wife, took over and she led Washington High Society. Officially, Jackson's sister was first lady, but she never lived in Washington. But John C. Calhoun's wife, Mrs. Calhoun, took over and ran Washington Society, and she and all the other Washington women would not recognize Mrs. O'Neill because of her background. Well, keep in mind, now Jackson's own departed wife had been slandered. So when the slander started against Mrs. O'Neill, Jackson sided with John O'Neill and his wife. Martin Van Buren had enough wisdom about him